Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November, if you can believe it, DIME webinar. I am delighted to welcome my colleagues, Valeria, Ari, and Fiona to lead a discussion today, guiding us through the ACRO Toolkit to advance decentralized clinical trial technology. And I think this is really important. Here at DIME, we are experts in digital, and digital is only one component of the decentralized sort of clinical trials toolbox. So I'm very excited to have fellow experts in the field join us, walk us through this new resource, and let us know the rest of the landscape that's surrounding digital when it comes to building clinical trials around patients and not the clinic. Before we dive in and I introduce my colleagues properly, first of all, welcome everyone on the line. Second, if you haven't joined us before for a DIME webinar, let me tell you a little bit about how we run the sessions. So first of all, full disclosure, you may have heard it announced as you joined, we are recording today's session. So what that does mean is likely sometime tomorrow, we will post both the session and the slides to the DIME website so you can share with colleagues should you find elements of today's talk particularly interesting. In addition, we welcome discussion. So Valeria, Fiona, and Ari are going to walk us through some slides. They're going to walk us through the toolkit. They're going to tell us why this is important and how we can use this new resource. We will then leave plenty of time for questions. There's a couple of ways we can handle that. Either you can raise your hand, not like this, but in the reactions ribbon at the bottom of your Zoom bar. We can call on you live. We'll unmute you and you can pose your questions live to our experts. Failing that, you can use either the comment or the chat functions to type in your question, and we'll make sure we get to that during discussion. So with that, let me call on my colleagues to go ahead and introduce themselves, and then I'm going to hand the reins and the slides, in fact, over to them to guide our discussion. So Fiona, Ari, Valeria, welcome. And I wonder if I could ask you to do some introductions to get you acquainted with everyone on the line. And Fiona, perhaps you could go first.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. Yes, my name is Fiona Maney, and I'm a Senior Director within the Global Compliance and Strategy Group at Metadata. I also chair the ACRO Decentralized Clinical Trials Working Party, which has been, I guess, a group that has been now going on for the last 3 years, really focusing on this decentralized clinical trials arena. Thank you.
Fantastic. Fiona, thanks for joining us today and look forward to learning from you. Valeria, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone next?
Of course, Jennifer. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having us here, Jennifer and DIME in general. I'm Valeria Orlova, and I'm a regulatory strategy analyst within the Metadata's Global Compliance and Strategy team. So I work along with my colleagues here on the call, Fiona and Ari. And I have been on the ACRO DCT Working Party and contributing to their toolkit since last year, and it's a great opportunity to be able to discuss the toolkit and introduce it to you today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic, Valeria. I'm delighted you're here, and I'm so sorry I've been mispronouncing your name and I feel awful. So you can just call me John for the rest of the day and we'll be square. Ari, last but not least, it was your idea to bring this fantastic toolkit to the DIME community. Please go ahead and say hi to everyone, and then I'm going to hand over the reins.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually that frankness that Jen expressed in terms of calling me John, which is probably when we initially met several years back at I want to say the industry conference. I don't even actually remember where. We had some colleagues in common, and ever since then we've really kept in touch on, what's been happening within the industry. And so this conversation, as both Fiona and Valeria already shared, at Metadata, we have a group called Global Compliance and Strategy. And as a technology provider, it's really everything compliance and regulatory as it relates to the product and services. And specifically, this group on the call today is really focused on the regulatory aspects. And depending on how things shake out in terms of where geographically, what's going on. And so though Fiona and Valeria do bear an English accent and are resident in the UK, this is really a global issue. And we're going to bring a global viewpoint. And so the way this actually came about was Jennifer and I were speaking, and we said, we're doing this work with ACRO, and maybe it's worth sharing with the DIME group. And so hence here we are today. So let me just talk a little bit about ACRO, what ACRO is, how we've gotten involved, the role we've taken. Then we can kind of get into the detailed material here. ACRO is the Association of Clinical Research Organizations, and it represents research and technology companies that are providing services within the clinical trial arena. The member companies are basically all over the world, representing 100 countries across the globe who conduct clinical trials worldwide. So what's today's topic? Today's topic about moving the needle about DCTs. First of all, let's talk about DCTs. It means it's a buzz term. We hear a lot about it. Let's just level set. When we talk about a DCT, we're talking about a decentralized clinical trial, and perhaps an overused term starting to really take on its own definitions. But a DCT is basically bringing the trial to the patient. So whether that's the healthcare provider, whether that's optimizing health technologies, whether that's whatever we can do to raise the voice of the patient, whether that's actually being able to enroll more patients in clinical trials that aren't necessarily aware of a clinical trial or can't access a site or a place to actually go for that clinical trial. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the decentralized model. So ACRO established a working party back in 2019, and the goal of that working party, which was chaired by Fiona here, was to facilitate the adoption of decentralized clinical trials. And it was made up of the ACRO member companies, and basically a group started to analyze what all this meant and what we needed to do to bring this to fruition. And so perhaps Fiona, maybe this would be a good time to kind of, if you want to dive into some of the materials at a high level, and then we can break apart the individual pieces and dive in a little bit more detail. I do want to, though, emphasize a point that Jennifer made earlier at the beginning of this call, which is I'm going to monitor the Q&A box and the hand raising. Would love to take questions or comments or concerns, or this is very much a hot topic, very much developing. I'm very aware that there's lots and lots and lots of industry conferences that are addressing this topic, and would love to really engage today. It's obviously some prepared remarks, but would love to take your questions. So with that, Fiona, maybe you want to just kick it off with the framework, and perhaps maybe start with the quality by design manual.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ari. So essentially, obviously, as Ari had mentioned, this working party was set up in 2019. And actually, we kicked it off with the MHRA. We basically, and the rationale was the FDA were also creating a working party on DCTs. We wanted to mirror that definitely here in the region as well. So essentially, we kicked off with an approach, and we went essentially to the MHRA to say, okay, these are the benefits of DCTs. What do you think? And and went through an approach with them. We developed a project charter of what we were going to achieve. And so essentially, we came up with two assets that we were going to create. One was a quality by design manual for DCT, so all the considerations, and the other was a risk assessment for DCTs as well. And so what are we talking about when we talk about quality by design? So quality by design really brings that systematic approach to drug development that aims to ensure quality by applying analytical and risk management methodologies to the design. So in our thinking, we were like, okay, let's implement quality by design and risk-based approaches to DCTs and look at it. So essentially, this slide is showing the assets that we created. We created quality by design manual. We created a risk assessment that looks at, you know, the risks and the questions you might want to ask when you're creating that protocol for a DCT. And those were created last year. We also have a white paper, which is essentially the third image on this slide, which really looks at the journey that we've taken, but it also gives a lot of really good case studies. So DCTs, you know, are not necessarily a new thing. They've been established in a hybrid model, for example, and the white paper really kind of talks to the journey that this group has taken, but it also talks to the case studies and where DCTs have really, really worked. Our quality by design manual was actually 40 pages long, and it was a lot of discussion within the ACRO group around, okay, we need to cut this down, we need to make it simpler. But I think because there have been so many thought processes going on, everybody wanted to keep, I guess, the manual as it was, 40 pages. But then from, you know, feedback, we've cut it down to 10 pages. So we took basically the 10 pages, the very consolidated view, and created a quick reference guide, which is actually now being used as a reference guide for some authorities. And that the quick reference guide is 10 pages. That came out literally September this year, along with the data flow maps. So the data flow maps were in response to authority feedback saying, essentially, you need to have a view of how the data flows within a DCT. And so that's what essentially the data flow maps provide, that view, very generic view of how that data is flowing behind the scenes. So obviously you have the patient, but then obviously there's so much going on in the background that the patient doesn't see. And it's providing that transparency of how data flows, for example, from wearables into an EDC, into other systems. So this is really the total toolkit, and I know Valeria will go through some of these aspects later on as well within this discussion. So it's been since 2019, and obviously it was an incredible kind of opportunity, or very timely, when obviously the pandemic happened and we needed to quickly go to more remote strategies. I think these guidances were extremely helpful during that time.
Yeah,
so
Fiona,
yeah.
As I actually look, I jotted down a question, but actually it was logged here as well. Maybe let's just talk about how you got to these data maps and the work that was done with ACRO and some of the regulatory authorities, because the question being posed is do they include data integrity and GXP control information? And I think that would be a good point to address now, given the level of effort that went into these data maps.
So the rationale and the reason why we did these data maps was because of the comments coming from the authorities. Actually, it was both the FDA and the MHRA to say, obviously, data integrity, data standardization are key elements, and so basically the fact that we did these data maps were on the basis of the authority feedback coming back. And obviously, the data integrity aspects, I mean, you can't apply, for example, AI unless you've got, good data integrity, standardized data models. And so that was a very key and important facet. And these data maps really just are very generic, quite high level. Not sure if I've answered your question completely, Ari, but
Yeah, I think the key here is that, you know, and perhaps this is what differentiates ACRO from some of the other materials. Again, there's a lot out there, right? Uh, this work was done in conjunction, I don't want to say in conjunction with, perhaps in consultation with, or in discussion with is probably the right word, with various regulatory authorities, where they've looked at it and said, you know, and they've given their input and feedback. So they're not necessarily saying, hey, this is what we, you know, we endorse you follow, but that certainly was taken into account. And, you know, maybe if we want to continue to move forward here, I don't know if we want to talk specifically, Fiona, about the manual, or if we want to kind of move forward into the risk assessment considerations. I know we've talked about the manual a little bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one important key piece here is the tube map that you can see in front of us. So this tube map, we basically leveraged the National Institute of Health Research of the UK, which have a clinical trial toolkit, and they have this this toolkit that essentially steps through each process. And so if you click on each of these kind of route stops, it goes through the process and it goes through the regulatory requirement, and it was incredibly helpful. So the ACRO DCT team went through every single process and looked at, okay, what do we do from a conventional and traditional clinical trial? What is different in a DCT world? And so you will see the green and the blue, and the green represents essentially okay, there is a slight difference, and there's a consideration that you need to think about when you're thinking about DCTs. So this took actually months to go through with the team, and there was a lot of debate, which is why the bringing the trial to the patient was, you know, 40 pages long, because actually we were trying to rectify also and make clinical trials in general more efficient, also from a paper-based situation. So this toolkit and these route stops was the fundamental basis that we took from the NIHR, was incredibly helpful. And essentially within, you know, we've gone really through very, very detailed kind of analysis. So yes, and yeah.
Fiona, I can't help but comment that, you know, as we were just coming into this, we were talking about accents, and for those of you who are not familiar, the tube is the London Underground.
Oh yeah.
And that would be like in America, we might call that a subway map. So which I know, Fiona, the subway is the route that goes under a road to, you know, to cross under a road. So perhaps there's just another one of those. So Jen, I hope you're laughing at that, being from the UK as well. So
I was almost about to pop something in the chat for folks. So I love that you picked up on that too.
Yeah. What, you know, maybe Valeria, should we just go ahead and talk about the risk assessment considerations?
Of course, Ari. So as Fiona has mentioned earlier in this discussion, the risk assessment consideration was the second document of the ACRO DCT toolkit. And really it is a downloadable template, which was based off the QBD manual. And perhaps it is one of the more customizable elements of the DCT toolkit, because essentially the purpose of this spreadsheet, which is the format it is currently downloadable in, is to identify and mitigate potential risk and really draw up a risk assessment that is specific to your specific trial that you might wish to implement DCT elements within. So really, this is one of the more interactive tools where we have the QBD manual, where you can research a lot of information, try to understand the considerations. We have the white paper with more background understanding and knowledge, the data flow maps, which we'll go into detail later as well. And this is the element where you can put the knowledge and information you've acquired from a toolkit into practical context for your specific trial. So Fiona, I know you've been working on this assessment consideration document as well. Not sure if you have anything else to add beyond that for this one.
No, I just think, I mean, it is a series of questions, and then it's a series of mitigations. So it gives potential mitigations, and it's clearly to kind of complement existing risk-based approaches or risk-based, you know, it's accompanying to essentially you know, normal risk processes.
So Fiona, I know that the first deliverable of the toolkit, or we put together a white paper to kind of bring it all together, and maybe how would you say that the best way we can leverage that white paper as a means of, you know, establishing a decentralized clinical trial?
I mean, I think this white paper is really a great kind of, it gives a great overview of the journey that we've taken. And there's so many different other organizations and associations working on the same stuff. So, you know, it's like, this is a great overview, but it also provides real-time kind of case studies. I think the case studies and the operational kind of knowledge and lessons learned are incredibly important. So yeah, this white paper provides the journey we've been on, but also those real-time life, you know, operational aspects.
And so, I mean, with that, you mentioned the condensed version of the QBD manual, the quick reference guide, and, you know, it was quite lengthy. So maybe, Valeria, I know Fiona touched on it, but perhaps maybe give a little bit more around the reasoning behind the condensed, you know, QBD manual, the quick reference guide, and how some of the folks, you know, on this webinar might go about using that.
Of course, Ari. So Fiona has currently mentioned earlier on in this conversation that we obviously have our 42-page QBD manual with all of the detailed information that you might need when really reading about the considerations for a DCT. Now, we have received feedback from authorities suggesting that we produce a more condensed version of that QBD manual, and that might be able to be used as a quick point of reference, as a first point of reference, or even as a training tool for some of these authorities as well. So we have condensed the 42-page document into a 10-page document and really tried to bring out a very focused version of the original QBD manual. And really, this document should be used perhaps as a first point of reference, where you'll be able to find very condensed and still focused information on DCTs. And it is sort of broken down into an introductory part where you'll still be able to read on about what DCTs are, the participant centricity of DCTs, and how COVID has perhaps accelerated or allowed for the use of more DCT elements. And the document itself is broken into pre-trial considerations as a part, and also actual trial processes. So the way one might be able to use this document is in terms of a preparation purpose. So for example, you might be able to read on the common themes in terms of considerations for DCTs, which are outlined at the start of the document, and they include things like IT solutions and applicable validation, contracts, training for investigators and participants, and regulatory considerations. They are very much ever encompassing for all DCTs. then you'll be able to also consider some more pre-trial considerations in order to help prepare you for the implementation and assess whether DCT is really applicable for your specific case scenario. And these include things such as general IT and system considerations, which are very important, trial planning and design and support there, as well as protocol development and approval. And the trial process section also touches upon some DCT elements specifically and gives specific considerations per those elements. These elements include, for example, informed consent, clinical trial supplies, monitoring and management, as well as ethics submission, inspections, and audits. So overall, this QBD manual as a quick reference guide can be used as a first, perhaps part of the toolkit to refer to and try to plan your trial, understand specific considerations.
And just also to add, thank you, Valeria, but just obviously it's probably a good, when you're starting out in DCT, is probably a good area to start is with the quick reference guide, but then there's significant detail within each of the areas. So if you were particularly interested in one area, then you could reference the QBD manual, the wider one.
So do we know, just looking at the chat and the questions here, I think it's still too early to know anyone that's gone through the process and been inspected on the back end, right? Because it would still be very early. But do we know of any specific examples of where these documents have been used early, let's say in the trial design and the go live and discussions with regulators?
So I would say we don't know. Obviously, we've been working and discussing with various authorities. The FDA said it was very useful, and also other authorities as well have commented this is very useful information. But they don't say outright that yes, we're using it. But it's been, I guess, a useful reference, I think, for authorities.
So, just maybe to go a little bit further, I remember being at an ACRO board meeting, and I think it was someone from the FDA who was there, and I don't remember exactly who. And the question that was posed, I want to say it was Scott Gottlieb at the time, actually. The question that was posed was to Dr. Gottlieb was, how is the agency advancing clinical trials? And after Dr. Gottlieb kind of gave his answer about what the agency was doing, he reverted back to the audience and he said, how are the pharma companies and the CROs bringing new ideas to the agency, right? And what he was really getting at in that sort of presentation was, hey, we're open to, and I don't know if industry necessarily shares this view, and I think this is where you have this little bit of tension, right? Which is, we, the agency, are open to your ideas. Come and present them, right? And don't be afraid of rejection. And I think that what we've seen, what ACRO has seen, particularly the folks on this call, in the work that we're doing, is that the agencies have been open to, the FDA and many of the other global regulatory authorities have been open to the conversation. So when we get towards the bottom of this, you'll see there's lots of different regulations coming out from different authorities around the world, and we've had the opportunity to engage with them. And perhaps that's what makes the ACRO materials a little bit different than some of the other materials that might be out there or coming out, in that there has been active engagement. So, to answer the question, I think it's still too early to see the results of any inspections. Perhaps we can only opine at this point on what we've seen in terms of early consultations. And maybe if you just want to dive in a little bit, Valeria, to the data flow maps. So obviously, this is a bit of an eye chart here, and the goal is not for you to read these and see these on this, see these on the screen in detail, but really just to discuss, perhaps, Valeria, at a high level, what the objective behind this project was and how these data flow maps might be useful.
Absolutely. And thank you, Ari, for highlighting that this is more of just a visual representation of the part of the toolkit being the data flow maps. I know they're not in high enough resolution. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through all of these, which would be ideal, but they are available on the ACRO website should you choose to go into them in more detail. Now, really talking about the background to how this project came about, I'd like to perhaps highlight one point that has been mentioned already by Ari and Fiona, being that we do engage a lot with regulators, with the ACRO DC Working Party, and more importantly, we listen to their feedback and try to address it. Now, these data flow maps are actually the perfect example of how ACRO DC Working Party has taken some of the feedback or recommendations from regulators and applied it in practice. So really, there was a GCP symposium by the MHRA and FDA, and in this symposium, there's been a recommendation voiced about the importance of providing a transparent view on how data flows, and really data integrity was highlighted there as a priority. And I know data integrity has also come up today already. So this is really, these maps are there to respond to this regulatory request of shining a light on the data flow, being more transparent about the background data transitions on the DCT. And this is where we portray them in a very visual way, as you might be able to see here. So I know Fiona's previously mentioned, obviously, that DCTs are all about the patient, but there's a lot going on in the background. And here is where we try to make it more clear, really to help everybody understand and disperse any doubts about what is going on in the data flows in the background. Now, as you might be able to see, we have 5 data flow maps on different DCT elements: e-consent, home health visits, connected devices, direct-to-patient supply of investigational products, and investigative participant interactions. These are the sort of 5 key elements of DCTs. And these maps, I must say, are very generic. They provide a generic view of the data flows. And they are high level for a reason, which is important to note, because the ACRO DCT Working Party really tried to make these maps applicable to different trial types, to different vendor systems, and different setup variations. So these maps can serve as a backbone, perhaps, to more detailed and more configured trial-specific maps in the future. And really, the purpose of this document is to shine a light and have a transparent view of the data flows. And we've actually managed to present these data flow maps to quite a lot of regulators this year already with ACRO DCT Working Party. And we've received a great amount of feedback, which has mostly been actually all been very, very positive. And I know we'll get into that later as well, as we go through our regulatory engagement with the group.
And thank you, Valeria. I just want to add as well that actually when we prioritized which maps we would do, we had 11, and then we whittled it down to 5. And one of the highest priorities in terms of data flow was around how to give patients their data, give the data back to patients. And so that is also probably our next priority, is like mapping out how that works. And obviously there's some there's definitely some regional projects going on here in Europe around that topic. So giving data back to patients was also a major priority that we're going to probably push forward on as well.
Yeah, do you want to talk about the listening sessions, because I think those were big contributors as well, right? To some of those were certainly great data points to producing the outputs, right?
Certainly, Ari. So actually just on the slide here, you'll be able to see a proportion, not by any means an exhaustive list of the regulators and stakeholders with whom the ACRO DCT Working Party has engaged in meetings or listening sessions. Now, what's happened over the past is there's been a great ongoing feedback mechanism with certain regulators where ACRO has been able to bring their DCT toolkit elements, present them, and then gather feedback. So data flow maps, being the latest toolkit component, the one I just spoke about previously, has been the most recent topic of discussion with these regulators. Now, you can see on the slide here, we have the MHRA and HRA, for example, in the UK, who the DCT Working Party have had an ongoing feedback mechanism with, all the way dating back to 2019, of the start of that ACRO DCT Working Party. MHRA have an innovation office, which is a really amazing open door for innovation for clinical research. So it's been great to discuss DCTs and the toolkits with them and really help bring technologies to help facilitate clinical trials. Now we also see the FDA. We've had discussions with the FDA on the data flow maps, and there's another session scheduled actually for later. So we're coming back to them to discuss the toolkit in more detail. And as a regulator, they're very approachable, which is a very big plus, certainly. And all these authorities and stakeholders have been very collaborative, which is certainly great news for the toolkit and for the industry in general, because that's how we can make progress overall as an industry. So you can see on the slide here, we've engaged with the NIHR, as Fiona has mentioned previously. We've engaged with the CTFG, Clinical Trial Facilitation Group of the HMA, ACA, which is American Telemedicine Association, and also Experimental Cancer Medicine Centers, ECMC, in the UK. Now, yes, sorry.
No, go ahead, Valeria.
I was just going to perhaps wrap up here saying that we have more meetings coming up, which are scheduled, for example, with the Danish authority and coming back to the FDA as well. And really the aim is, the outcome of each of these sessions is feedback. We respond to this feedback, which is how we've created a quick reference guide and the data flow maps in retrospect. And the regulatory engagement, the information exchange actually flows both ways between the ACRO DCT Working Party presenting the toolkit and the regulators, because both are able to learn from each other's experience. There are some questions on practical DCT experience that regulators ask the DCT Working Party, considerations, practical applications and benefits they've been able to see in practice. And then that helps regulators understand the possibilities and then potentially shape future guidance as well, as we'll talk about later.
Well, that's exactly the point. So, you talk about guidance, and when you look at this next slide, this is by no means representative of everything, but you can see these are all documents that are dated in 2021. We've seen a lot of movement based on the discussions with various health authorities, regulators in country, across Europe. So I guess the point here is, the takeaway is we engage. Right, we're not afraid of the engagement. And so going back perhaps to the question that was posed earlier about what the outcome is of inspections, I think that while we don't know the answer to that, we do know that these materials are not just being authored out there without that level of input. I wouldn't say that it's going to be an easy shoe-in, as the case may be, to go use these documents, but it has been an industry collaborative effort. So, I think that really covers a lot of the sort of prepared materials. I know there's been some questions here, and I want to make sure that we leave some time for that. So, I don't know, Jen, did you have any comments or sort of closing remarks before we open the floor up here to questions?
Of course I do, but I'd much rather hear from our colleagues on the line. So why don't we do this? Doug, if I can, you've posed, actually, let me pause for a second. Valeria, Fiona, Ari, absolutely phenomenal work and a huge amount of work here. And yes, I have lots and lots of questions, but I want to prioritize some of the terrific ones that Doug has actually posed in the chat. And Doug, you should be able to unmute yourself actually and pose your question live to our experts now, if you'd like to.
Okay.
Oh, we had you there for a second.
Hey, it's on mute.
Can you?
Yes, got an echo.
Well, so it seems like we're having the tech issue here. So I'll address the question here being the risk assessment part and the use of additional vendors. So I can certainly take that from what we've seen from a technology perspective. I think this is it's about risk appetite, right? And so I think the model of, and this I can say we have seen acceptance, right? The model of I need to own, whether I'm the sponsor or the CRO, I need to own and audit and document every hop and move in the timeline of the clinical trial is becoming more and more and more impossible with the adoption of technology, DCT or not, right? Because when you start to introduce wearables, when you start to introduce ECOA, when you start to introduce lots of other contributing factors, and also adding the voice of the patient, right? All those different things are going to complicate what was the clinical trial ecosystem of old. I can say that, and so you have to look at, okay, from a risk assessment perspective, how do I, as a sponsor, as a biopharma, as a CRO, gain that understanding of how the data is moving, right? And so yes, I ultimately in that role have to represent that I can demonstrate an understanding. But when it comes down to the technical aspects of it, there has to be some level of comfort that's gained from the vendor assessment in and of themselves, right? The technology, the transparent, and by the way, no technology is perfect, right? There are going to be issues along the way. You name it. Anytime we all use technology in our daily lives, technology is not perfect, but neither are humans in manual intervention. And so the concepts of data integrity in my mind, when you think about that from a risk assessment perspective, in fact, are probably more improved today than they were previously when we were on paper, because there was, you can add edit checks. You can know right away that someone's blood pressure is out of whack, right? It doesn't make any sense based on systematic edit checks, right? So there's puts and pulls, but I don't believe that a DCT approach is I think you need to look at the risk assessment more broadly when you're using technology. Now, I don't recall, Fiona or Valeria, do we specifically address, are there any specific points in the materials that address risk assessment specifically?
Absolutely. We obviously created a risk assessment template that highlights all of the different areas of risk, and then there are mitigations as well. So that is the risk assessment template that we've provided, and it was part of the QBD, and it's on the ACRO website. So that's already there. And it's also complementary.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry,
complementary to existing risk assessment that already happen.
Yeah, and I think just going a little bit further on the risk assessment, where oftentimes where we see the regulatory challenge is when you can't answer the question of demonstrating I understand how the data is moving and that I've actually assessed it versus you putting an assessment together and someone disagreeing with the conclusion you've reached. I rarely see that so much as I see the former where, and I'll use audit trails as a good reference, right? It's table stakes, right? Audit trails are a necessity in this environment. We all know that. The question is, what are you doing with those audit trails, right? You generate hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of data points on just a simple clinical trial on a daily basis on each visit, right? So what are you doing with that data? And where we've seen these types of issues come to bear is when they're represented to a regulatory authority of, yep, I've got audit trails. The very next question is, of course you do, but what are you doing with them, right? Where are you looking at for your, where are you focusing for your, analysis, right? Some sites are better than others. Some trials are better than others. Some countries are better than others, right? So you got to look at and figure out where you're going to focus and create your risk assessment around that. And I think the same is true in a DCT space. Absolutely true in a DCT space. See, what I bring to this table is I did not grow up in the clinical trial space. I grew up in the governance, risk, and control space, and so more broadly across industries. And so I look at risk perhaps a little bit differently than folks who grew up in this space. And maybe that's why, the conversation that probably one of the original conversations, Jen, that you and I had was around this, right? So, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart.
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that? Because one of the things I think often as a consequence of sort of the pandemic is, people ask how and why it sort of changed things. And on the one hand, you sort of feel that it's obvious how and why it did. But if we go down to the root cause, I think, and Fiona and Valeria, I think it sort of changed our risk tolerance as an industry, right? There was a greater risk because of trial continuity and a realization that we're really exposed to these sort of external influences. The risk of not doing this suddenly started to appear much greater than the risks of doing this. And I'm curious to see, as you sort of work in the field and you're implementing these things, is that the case, or am I mistaken here? Which happens.
I don't know if Fiona, go ahead. You probably have I know I have a viewpoint, but
yeah, no, I mean, obviously, I think what we did see over the last year was obviously a prioritization for COVID trials, and other trials were kind of put on hold. And I think that was, that's been a major issue. We're still obviously, going through that. And I think that, a lot of the technologies that could help clinical trials continue or be more efficient going forward, those processes and those technologies are established. It's nothing new. It's just having them adopted and moving forward. And I think obviously COVID has been a catalyst for kind of more remote strategies. But these are things that these are systems that are validated. They are clinical grade systems that already exist and that actually are easy to potentially adopt. And Ari, I don't know what your thoughts were on that as well.
So I'm always a big believer in the adoption of technology, and I'll use a direct example. When COVID came around, the impact to our organization, I can speak specifically to my group and perhaps to the broader company, was somewhat minimal because we were already using technology in everything that we were doing, right? So there was nothing that was afforded to me in the office, aside from meeting with my colleagues in person, right? And that's a very important aspect to deliver clinical trials. And in fact, things got crazier with all the COVID trials, right? With the COVID specific, trials that were starting up and enrolling a high volume of patients, things actually got busier. That said, we did see a quick response from many of the global regulatory authorities on adopting changes in the emergency situation.
Yeah.
We have since seen, and somewhat disheartening, we have since seen some regulatory authorities say, well, these are just temporary, and we are planning to revert to the pre-COVID ways. And so, Jen, I think it's perhaps a sensitive topic, and we continue to engage in those conversations because, like you, I think COVID made folks realize, like, hey, we have to continue clinical trials, non-COVID, right? We have to continue clinical trials. How do we do that, right? And now there's some level of perspective of, well, maybe there is a little bit of a compromise. So
I agree.
Oh, so there's Doug. I do see your question there about remote source data verification. The reason why I'm sort of laughing about it is because it was originally a topic that we thought about discussing today, and just thought it might be that this combined with DCTs might be just a little too much ground to cover. But I'll say at a high level, and maybe, Jen, maybe that's a topic for a future date, but I'm happy to cover that as well. We have done, I can't speak for ACRO. From a metadata perspective, we have done a lot of work across the industry and with regulatory authorities around remote source data verification. They being the agencies, the regulators, have come out with perspectives on RSDV. And we could certainly share perspectives on that. Obviously not under the not as much under the umbrella of ACRO. But yes, it would, from our perspective, it would include some of the ideas around RSDV.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't know, Jen, I don't know if you have any comments on RSDV from what you see, but in your experience in the clinical trial space, albeit perhaps not the most current, but I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
No, I think, this is one of the things that I would sort of offer up here is, there are times when technology is not the correct solution to a problem, but I think technology almost has the solution baked in here. There are absolutely things we can do using the technologies available to us. And in fact, the very same technologies we're using to sort of deploy for remote source data, especially when it comes to things like sensors, right? To sort of do the necessary timestamping, to be sure that we have the necessary audit trails that accompany sort of every data point, every stop as it goes through the sort of data chain into the sort of EDC and data sets for analysis. That can all be baked in when we go to technology. It doesn't have to be a manual add-on process like it always has been when we've been using non-technology sort of processes to both capture and then input the data. So I actually see this as being something that, we have to be very clear to the vendor community about what our expectations are and what the requirements are for using these technologies out in the field. But quite frankly, this is a very, very solvable problem. And to me, and perhaps we can think about using this as sort of a closing thought, what you've articulated here is absolutely tremendous. And my main takeaway is that there's nothing that we need to do to move towards a more fully decentralized clinical trials enterprise that we are not capable of doing. It's about aligning incentives. It's about folks feeling comfortable with it. But there isn't anything that we don't know how to do in a way that is sort of scientifically correct, that is safe, that is high rigor. That's sort of my takeaway from what you've put together here. And you've sort of simply outlined it in a really nice and accessible way with the maps and so on and so forth. Ari, maybe I can hand it back to you, Fiona and Valeria, to do sort of closing thoughts, and then I'll round us out.
Yeah, I just want to, I want to express significant gratitude to ACRO. Of course, to my colleagues, Fiona and Valeria, this has been a lot of time invested from their perspective. And you might have picked up on the slide that that there was a nomination for a TOPR award in the UK for innovation. So that's still pending. I think we find out later this month, if I'm not mistaken, Fiona. So I think there is recognition that again from agencies outside of the ACRO or umbrella that recognize the work that's been done here, but more broadly to ACRO, who together, as an organization has gotten, resources from its member companies to collaborate to create these materials. And there's, like Valeria alluded to, these materials are available on the ACRO website, and they are looking, as an organization, ACRO, we are looking to advance the use of technology in the clinical trials and advance science, right? There's no doubt about that. We meet on a very regular basis to discuss these topics and how we as an industry organization can help move things forward. So significant gratitude to them, to the umbrella organization, to ACRO, and of course to Dime for picking this up in a sort of offhanded remark that I had made to Jen, and I think it was great to share this today. I hope everyone found it useful, and of course I know you're going to be sharing the materials, and we can certainly happy to, our contact details are there. If not, Dime can provide those, and we're happy to engage. So Jen, any closing comments?
A really terrific presentation. I think that, this is, as you said, there's a lot of, and just to confirm, can you guys see my slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. I want to thank each of you. This was absolutely tremendous. Kudos to the whole ACRO team. It was really fantastic to hear about the listening sessions and all the hard work that went into this. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that this is a very complex and multifaceted industry. So taking the time to learn what our colleagues are doing, where other pockets of information and sort of resources exist. Here at Dime, we specialize in the digital elements, but yet that's only one tool in the DCT toolbox. So exposing our colleagues to a lot of the other work and considerations that go with it, learning from you today was absolutely fantastic. So Valeria, got it right that time. Fiona and Ari, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone on the line, this was a terrific discussion. Appreciate your engagement with our colleagues. We will be posting the slides, the links to the ACRO resources, and the recording to the Dime website. Should you be interested in diving in further, having learned more from our experts on the line today. Quick look ahead before we wrap. We have a Journal Club coming up, crikey, just a week away on November 17th. And also, how are we at November 17th? This will be looking at a recent JIMA publication that came out of our work on the playbook, specifically looking at some of the sort of areas of focus of academic research vis-a-vis digital clinical measures, and also some of the gaps. We'll be discussing sort of what that means for the field, where funding is needed, and sort of next steps to make sure that we keep pursuing the advancement of digital clinical measures in a way that's safe and effective. So with that, thank you so much. Very, very grateful, Valeria, Fiona, and Ari, for your time and expertise today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.